Section 11 of Psychology, the Cognitive Powers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. Psychology, the Cognitive Powers by James McCosh. Book 2nd. The Reproductive or Representative Power. The Recalling Power or Fantasy, Part 1. Its nature. As long as an object is merely retained, it is not before the consciousness, and in fact may never be so. But it may come into consciousness according to laws of association to be unfolded in the next chapter. Every man, woman, and child has a chamber where he or she has laid up a store of images or photographs of the objects which have been perceived. It may be interesting to take a look into it and inspect its contents, which will be found to be very curious. Every man has his own chamber of imagery with its separate furniture, grave or gay. It is the place of figures and fantasies. I call the power which reproduces in old or in new forms our past experiences the fantasy, a phrase employed by Aristotle to denote one of the faculties of the mind, and which was used in the English tongue down to the beginning of the last century, when it was abbreviated into fancy, with a more confined meaning. The product may be called the phantasm, always to be distinguished from the phantom, in which the object is imaginary. Fantasy is a good phrase to designate the remembrance or imaging of a single object, say a lily, as distinguished from a general idea, such as the class lily. The faculty may also be called the imaging or pictorial power, only there is no image or picture except when the reproduction is of an object perceived by the sense of sight, the other senses, however, being also capable of reviving what is passed before us. It is the mind's eye of Shakespeare, in my mind's eye, Horatio. All these phrases are figurative, always implying and pointing to a reality. We talk of an image, a likeness, a representation, an idea. In what sense? So far as the sense of sight is concerned, there is an image on the retina of the eye, but this is so situated that it is not seen naturally. In fact, it has been discovered by science. The object is perceived upright, but it is inverted in the eye. Then, so far as the other senses are concerned, there is no image, properly speaking. There is merely an affection of the organ, of the ear, the touch, the palate, the nostrils. Speaking rigidly, there is no image of a taste or a sound. Even so far as vision is concerned, the image on the retina cannot be said to be perceived by the mind. It is merely an affection of the organism, of such a kind that it becomes the fitting means by which the exact form and color of the object are known, just, and not otherwise, as an ear makes known the sounds emitted. In respect of an image, there can be no such thing in the brain in regard to any of the senses. In all the senses, there is an affection not only of the physical part of the senses proper, but of the brain. But this does not take the shape of a form of any kind. If there is no figure in the brain, still less can there be in the mind. A figure is an extended material thing. The figure of a tree is no more in the mind than the tree is. In all the senses, the perception is simply a knowledge of an object under a certain aspect, say as having a form or odor. In this sense only is an idea the representation of an object. There is really no likeness between gold as out of the mind and the idea of gold in the mind. There is a correspondence between the two, but no identity. In fact, this imaging power is merely one of the factors in the memory. In memory, there is a recognition of an object or event as having been before us in time past, but in the mere imaging, there is no such recognition and no reference to time. We may have a phantasm of a flower without any belief as to where or when we saw it, or indeed as to whether we ever saw it. But in all proper memory, there is an image or phantasm, dull or vivid, representing the object or event recognized. It has to be added that the mind has the power of forming imaginary figures. These are compositions constructed by the mind out of realities experienced. We have now not memory, but imagination. Our imaginations, as everyone knows, are often more lively than our recollections. The mind delights to form such pictures, and it is the office of the poet and novelist to raise them up by the presentations they furnish. First, we can thus reproduce the material got by any of the senses. We remember tastes of salt, of sugar, of jelly, of apples, of oranges, and hundreds of other things that are sour or sweet, or do otherwise powerfully affect our palate pleasantly or unpleasantly. These recollections are not especially inspiring or poetical, but are cherished by gourmands who feel as it were the taste in their mouth of the food they relish. We can recall the sensation produced by odors, say from roses, lilies, and violets, or from asafoetida, swamps, and malarial pools. Some of these are of an ethereal nature and have a place allowed them in poetry. We can call up 1,000 kinds of sounds, as the voices of our friends, the sighings of the breeze or stream, the barking of the dog, the mewing of the cat, the bellowing of the bull, the lowing of cattle, the chirp or the song of birds, say of the thrush or nightingale, the screech of the eagle, the rasping of the file, the mower whetting his scythe, the roar of the storm, the lashing of the wave on the shore, the rolling of the thunder, the crash of the avalanche. People endowed with a musical ear can recall tunes and are prompted to repeat them, and some are constantly hearing musical airs. Music, when soft voices die, vibrates in the memory. Odors, when sweet violets sicken, live within the sense they quicken. There are touches which we easily remember, of softness or smoothness, say of satin, or of a smooth skin, or of the prickliness of a briar or thorn. The child retains forever the memory of a mother's kiss, but we get our most vivid and varied memories from the sense of sight. We delight to remember colors, say of a flower or a piece of dress, of the morning and evening sky. We image certain forms, as of the persons and faces of our friends, of noble trees, of well-proportioned buildings, of mountains, all that is picturesque, that is picture-like, that is with a well-defined shape, as steeples, cliffs, precipices leave a photograph of themselves on our souls. The artist uses many of these in his paintings, in his portraits, and in his landscapes. The poet turns them to all sorts of uses in pleasing and exciting and elevating the mind. This imaging power helps greatly to enliven our existence. We call up an incident of our childhood. We remember the day on which we were first sent to school, and how we set out from our parents' roof with strangely mingled feelings of confidence and timidity. As we bring back the scene, mark how everything appears with a pictorial power. We have a vivid picture, it may be, of the road we traveled. We see, as it were, the schoolhouse within and without. We hear the master addressing us, and the remarks which the children passed upon us. Or, more pleasant still, we remember a holiday trip in the company of genial companions or kind relatives to a place interesting in itself or by its associations, or the visit we paid to the house of a good friend who had 1,000 contrivances to please and entertain us. How vivid at this moment the picture before us of the incidents of the journey, of the little misfortunes that befell us, of the amusements provided for us, of the persons, the countenances, the smiles, the voices and words, of those who joined us in our mirth or ministered to our gratification. We not only recollect the events, we, as it were, perceive them before us. The imaging is an essential element of our remembrance. Wordsworth is painting from the life when he speaks of those recollected hours that have the charm of visionary things, those lovely forms and sweet sensations that throw back our life and almost make remotest infancy a visible scene on which the sun is shining. Or possibly there may be scenes which have imprinted themselves more deeply upon our minds, which have, as it were, burned their image into our souls. Let us throw back our mind upon the time when death first intruded into our dwelling. We remember ourselves standing by the dying bed of a father, and then we recall how a few days after we saw the corpse put into the coffin and then borne away to the grave. How terribly distinct and startling do these scenes stand before us at this instant. We see that pallid countenance looking forth from the couch upon us. We hear that voice becoming feebler and still feebler, and then we feel as if we were looking at that fixed form which the countenance took when the spirit had fled. We follow the long funeral as it winds away to the place of the dead, and we hear the earth falling on the coffin as the dust is committed to its kindred dust. Secondly, it should be specially noticed that not only are we able to represent these sensible scenes, we are further able to picture the thoughts and feelings which passed through our minds as we mingled in them. Not only do we remember the road along which we traveled and the building which we entered, we can bring up the feelings with which we set out from our parents' house and those with which we passed into the school. Not only do we recollect the amusements which so interested us, but the feelings of interest with which we engaged in them. Not only do we picture the chamber in which a father breathed his last, we can call up the mingled emotions of anxiety, of hope or fear, with which we watched by his dying bed, and the grief which overwhelmed us as we realized the loss we had suffered. We bring up the feelings which chased each other as we sat by his corpse, or when we returned to our home and felt all to be so blank and melancholy. We can thus live our mental experiences over again, the efforts we made to acquire a branch of knowledge, a new language, or a new science, and how we found the process to be irksome or stimulating, what we felt in our failures or our successes, in our fights and in our triumphs, in our friendships and in our enmities, in our temptations yielded to and our temptations resisted. As we survey the past, we can remember the gratitude we felt on kindness shown us, the sorrow that overwhelmed us on the death of a friend, the bitterness of the disappointment when our best hopes were frustrated, when one we trusted betrayed us, and the pang that shot through us when we found that we had committed an unworthy deed. We are obliged to use metaphorical language in describing these recollections. We speak of our being able to image or picture to ourselves the outward incidents and the inward feelings, and we thus set forth an important truth. True, we cannot give these mental states a sensible figure. The reason is obvious. They had no visible or tangible form when we first experienced them, and the memory in reproducing them will represent them as they first presented themselves. This circumstance, I may add in passing, furnishes an argument of some little force in favor of the immateriality of the soul. In our primary knowledge and in our subsequent recollection of bodies, we have a sensible image, but in our consciousness of our mental states and in our recalling them, we do not, and indeed cannot, so represent them. We give a bodily shape to the school at which we learned our tasks, to the persons and countenances of our early associates, but we cannot give a form or local habitation to our remembered cogitations and sentiments which live in a higher sphere. It is conceivable that the memory might have been as correct as it is to matters of fact without having any pictorial power. In fact, the majority of our memories must be of this character. It is well it should be so, for otherwise excitement would waste our life and keep us from the performance of many commonplace but important duties. But that is a most benignant endowment whereby we can image absent objects and past events, lay them up in chambers of imagery, and make them pass as in a panorama before us. We can thus have a series of paintings of all the scenes in which we have mingled, a set of portraits of the friends with whom we had sweet intercourse, and we can view them as Cowper did his mother's portrait. Faithful remembrancer of one so dear, and while that face renews my filial grief, fancy shall weave a charm for my relief, shall steep me in Elysian reverie, a momentary dream that thou art she. By contemplation's help, not sought in vain, I seem to have lived my childhood o'er again, to have renewed the joys that once were mine, without the sin of violating thine, and while the wings of fancy still are free, and I can view this mimic show of thee. Time has but half succeeded in his theft. Thyself removed, thy power to soothe me left. This imaging power, as it enlivens the mind, also tends to give vividness to its productions in words and writings. He is an interesting companion who, having laid up a store of pictures, is ever bringing them out in his conversation. Travelers and biographers instruct us best when they are able to give us a word painting of the scene and of the man or woman. History is vastly more attractive when it gives the event with its concomitants, say the battle with the field on which it was fought. Our pictorial writers are generally the most popular. In the medieval ages, they illuminated the manuscripts to attract and delight the eye. In our day, books in almost every department of literature are illustrated. This power has a still more important function. Nothing tends more to degrade the mind and sink it in the mire than low and sensual images. On the other hand, images of duty, of self-sacrifice, of courage, of honor, of beauty, of love, elevate and ennoble the soul. Some of the phantasms are much more vivid than others. They differ also in the case of different individuals, and of the same individual at different times or in different states of his body. It is a curious question what can be the cause of this difference. Without professing to exhaust the subject, we may specify some circumstances which undoubtedly have an influence on the vividness of the picture. 1. There is the original vividness of the sensation, depending primarily on the sensitiveness of the organ, but under this also upon the nature of the object perceived. The senses evidently differ in this respect. The most lively is the sense of sight. The forms and colors originally made known by it may come up almost with the distinctness of the realities. The mental representation, we can scarcely call it picture, of sounds is often very intense, especially in the case of those who have a musical ear, but also when the impression on the ear is strong or vehement, made, for instance, by the bursting of a cannon. Tastes and odors may also be recalled with less impressiveness, as also touches and feelings in our nerves. There are times when our sensations of shapes, colors, and sounds are very intense, and in these cases they are apt to be reproduced with greater vividness. There are scenes of gorgeous coloring. There are picturesque figures, such as horrid precipices. There are sounds such as those of a falling rock, of thunder, or of an avalanche, which we can never forget. Some persons are evidently more susceptible of intense impressions than others, and in these cases the images are apt to be more vivid, and these may be embodied in paintings and statues, or in word painting and prose or poetry. 2. The formation of the image is dependent on the state of the brain. It is believed that even in our sense perceptions there is brain action. It seems to be established that the third convolution of the left side of the cerebrum is the organ of the symbolic power, or of language. Some eminent men, such as Hitzig and Fritsch and Ferrier, maintain that each sense has a separate location in the brain. Others deny this. Without entering into this discussion, it is allowed that brain action is necessary to sense action. The whole eye might be perfect, and yet there is no vision if there be a lesion in certain parts of the brain. Not only so, but brain action is required in order to the reproduction of our sense perceptions. Now it is highly probable that the same part of the brain acting in the perception is necessary in order to its reproduction. When there is a lesion of a certain part of the brain, it may not be possible to form an image of the object. In all cases, the vividness of the image may depend on the health and susceptibility of the brain matter. It is well known that persons may lose certain of their recollections while they retain others. The defect seems to arise from a lesion of the brain. We have the record of persons losing the power of picturing forms while their memory was good in all other respects. We have more frequent instances of people losing their power of using languages or particular languages. This is the disease of aphasia, arising from a derangement in the organ of language. There are cases of persons losing a portion of their knowledge for a time and then recovering it, perhaps losing it suddenly and recovering it as suddenly. In all such cases, it looks as if, in acquiring the original knowledge, there is a certain state of the brain produced, say by a certain disposition of the molecules, probably in the gray matter in the periphery of the brain. Where there is an effacement or derangement of this matter in the brain, the knowledge cannot be recalled. Sometimes the disorganization is only for a time, and when it is cured, the mental power is ready to act. 3. There is the mental force, particularly of the attention directed to the scenes as they first passed before us. We were interested in them. We turned them round and round. We viewed them under various aspects, and having been so encouraged and fondled, they are apt to visit us again and again, and put on their best expression. The painter has to study the features of landscapes and the countenance and attitudes of men and women to give us correct figures on his canvas. Under this view, the capacity of bringing up images is more within our power than we might at first imagine. End of section 11.